It begins, as many things do, not with a grand discovery, or a sudden revelation. But with something very ordinary. Someone, somewhere, sitting in front of a bowl of something warm. And realizing they had no idea how to get it into their mouth without burning their fingers. There were no spoons yet. No polished silver, no plastic, no measurement markings. Just a bowl, some hot liquid, and the first flicker of a quiet human thought. Maybe, there should be something, to help. Tonight, on Whisper Sleep Histories. We won't talk about wars or kings. No revolutions, no great battles, no empires rising or falling. Just the slow, humble evolution of an object so ordinary. You likely used one today without a second thought. This is not the history of glory. It's the history of scooping. And of soup. And of 2,000 years of human beings trying not to spill anything on themselves. So lie back. Let the lights dim. And drift gently into the story of the spoon. Before anyone built a pyramid, or mapped a star, or thought to name the wind, someone had a bowl of something hot. It wasn't remarkable. It probably didn't taste very good. It may have been little more than boiled roots, or thin porridge, or water warmed over a fire with some leaves thrown in. But it was warm, and it was food, and that was enough. The problem was simple, and oddly persistent. The liquid was too hot to drink directly, and too thin to eat with fingers. So the person sat, watched the steam curl upward, and wondered how to get it from the bowl to the mouth without spilling too much or burning themselves. That was all. No grand invention followed. No sudden insight. Just a pause. Then maybe they picked up something. A shell, or a bit of curved bark. Not because they wanted to change the world, but because their fingers were tired, and the soup was dripping down their wrists. It's possible the first spoon was never meant to last. It may have been tossed aside after one use. It may not have worked very well at all. But over time, the idea stuck. Not in writing. Not in art. Just in habit. The habit of scooping. Of carrying. Of trying to get something into your mouth with a little more dignity and a little less mess. Slowly, across centuries, across continents, that habit became a shape. A curve at the end of a stick. Sometimes round. Sometimes narrow. Sometimes long, sometimes shallow. Sometimes made of wood, or horn, or bone, or clay. And later, silver. Later still, steel. And much, much later, plastic. But all of them, in their own quiet way, were trying to do the same thing. Move something warm from one place to another without dropping it. The spoon does not have a dramatic origin story. No one leapt from a bathtub shouting Eureka because they had finally cracked the problem of soup. No one fought a war over the rights to use it. It didn't topple kings or start revolutions. It didn't change the course of history. But it was there, quietly, in every place people sat down to eat. It was there before the alphabet. Before coins. Before chairs. It doesn't get mentioned in epic poems. Homer doesn't describe Achilles stirring his broth with a well-wrought spoon of bronze. Shakespeare never gave Hamlet a soliloquy about the depth of his father's gravy. Even so, the spoon was always in the background, helping things along, doing its job. Some say civilization began with the wheel. Others say it was fire, or agriculture, or the calendar. But there is a case to be made for the spoon. Not a strong case, perhaps. But a quiet one. Because to need a spoon is to have a bowl. And to have a bowl is to have food worth preparing. And to prepare food is to stay in one place long enough to cook it. And to stay in one place is to build a fire. And a roof. And a rhythm. And slowly, without meaning to, a life. The earliest spoons we've found are thousands of years old. They turn up in tombs and kitchens, in temples and middens. Some are ceremonial. Others are plain. Some have handles shaped like animals, or gods, or flowers. Others are little more than smooth sticks. Some were meant to impress. Others were meant to serve. Most were never meant to last. But a few did. They ended up buried beside their owners, or lost in dry places, or dropped in mud that turned to stone. And now we study them. Measure them. Photograph them. Write careful notes about their curvature and material. All for a tool that rarely draws attention when it's doing its job. It is strange, in a way, that something so ordinary has such a long history. And yet it makes sense. Because eating is ordinary. So is being too tired to chew. So is being sick and needing something soft. So is wanting to taste something before it cools. These aren't dramatic needs. They don't make headlines. But they make lives. And the spoon, for all its simplicity, is part of those lives. Not at the center. Not with fanfare. But just off to the side, ready to help. We don't think about spoons very often. We don't name them. We rarely choose them carefully, unless they're part of a wedding gift. We misplace them, toss them in drawers, stir coffee with them, let them slide under the table without noticing. But we would notice if they were gone. Not right away. Not in panic. But gradually. We'd find ourselves lifting bowls to our lips again, or trying to pour soup into cups, or fashioning something out of cardboard in a moment of mild frustration. And we'd realize, a little sheepishly, that the spoon had been doing more work than we gave it credit for. Tonight, on Whisper Sleep Histories, we won't be talking about empires or philosophies or inventions that reshaped the world. We'll be talking about the spoon. Not the golden ones in museums, or the elaborate ones carved for kings, though those will appear along the way. But mostly, we'll be tracing the slow, nearly invisible path of the everyday spoon. The kind passed quietly from hand to hand, forgotten on the edge of the table, or tucked into a pocket before a journey. The kind used to stir stew. Or porridge. Or tea. Or cough syrup. Or the last bit of yogurt from the bottom of the cup. We'll move slowly. Not because there is too much to say, but because there is just enough. Enough to follow the curve of the spoon through history. Enough to notice where it shows up, and where it changes. Enough to see how even something small can carry meaning, if you look closely, and long enough. So if your eyes are heavy, let them close. If your thoughts are busy, let them drift. You won't miss anything urgent. There is no climax ahead. Only the quiet rise of something curved and useful. The soft clink of metal against bowl. The steam rising. The hand lifting. The lips parting. And the history of a thing that made dinner just a little bit easier. This is the story of the spoon. And like the object itself, it doesn't need to be exciting. It just needs to work. Long before history began to write itself down, long before dates had numbers or names had syllables we could still pronounce, people lived in places that no longer exist. Not in the sense that they were destroyed or lost, but in the sense that they never had names to begin with. A clearing in the woods. A bend in a river. A patch of grass beside a cave. These were places known only to those who stayed there, and only for as long as they stayed. Nothing was recorded. No journals, no monuments, no signposts. Just footsteps, ashes, and the things they left behind by accident. In those places, meals happened. Not often, and not always predictably. Food didn't arrive on a schedule, and it didn't wait. It came in bursts, when an animal wandered too close, or a tree dropped something edible, or someone remembered where they'd buried a few roots the season before. When there was food, people cooked it. Not elaborately. Not elegantly. They didn't slice or season or pair anything with anything else. They heated it, usually in a pot, sometimes in a pit, sometimes on a flat stone that had been left near the fire long enough to grow warm. And once it was warm, they had to figure out how to eat it. Fingers were good for some things. Pulling meat from bones. Crushing berries. Holding flatbread. But not for soup. Not for porridge. Not for things that dripped or scalded. When you're tired, and the food is hot, and your fingers are cold and cracked, the last thing you want is to end your day by spilling something you worked hard to catch or gather. So slowly, without anyone announcing it, the habit of using something else began to form. Not a spoon yet, but an idea that would eventually become one. The idea that you could use a thing to move another thing, and that thing could be used again. We don't know who did it first. There is no name. There is no drawing. There is only speculation, and fragments, and the general understanding that this probably happened a lot earlier than we used to think. Archaeologists have found shells with wear patterns that suggest use. Not for cutting. Not for digging. But for scooping. They found fragments of horn, bent and polished, that could have served the same purpose. And bits of bone, hollowed by time or intention, just curved enough to cradle something soft and warm. Were these things spoons? Not exactly. They weren't shaped like the ones we use now. They didn't have long handles or balanced bowls. But they served a purpose. They made things easier. And when things are easier, people tend to repeat them. Not because they plan to pass them on to the next generation. But because it works. Because when your hands are full of calluses and your lips are chapped from wind and smoke, the difference between eating and eating comfortably starts to matter. The prehistoric spoon, if we can even call it that, didn't evolve all at once. It didn't begin as an object, but as a behavior. A gesture. Something observed and copied. Maybe someone saw another person use a shell to lift water from a stream. Maybe they tried it themselves, and found it worked better than leaning down and drinking like an animal. Maybe the shell cracked, and they tried something else. A gourd. A hollowed piece of wood. A palm-sized stone with a natural dip in the middle. Over time, preferences formed. And where preferences form, shapes follow. In some regions, people favored wood. It was soft, easy to carve, and abundant. In others, bone was more reliable. It held its shape better. Didn't burn. Lasted longer. In coastal areas, shells were plentiful and ready-made. They didn't require modification. Just a good grip. Somewhere along the way, someone may have attached a stick to the back of one. Not to make it look elegant, but because it kept their hands farther from the heat. A small adjustment, made in a moment of mild discomfort. But that adjustment may have been the beginning of the handle. And once there's a handle, the rest of the design tends to follow. But we must be careful not to assume too much. The temptation with prehistory is always to project. To imagine that these people were either exactly like us or nothing like us. In truth, they were somewhere in between. They didn't think about tools the way we do. They didn't write instruction manuals or carve labels into things. A spoon wasn't a spoon. It was just a thing that helped with a task. And if it broke, they made another. Or didn't. Depending on how much energy they had. Depending on whether the soup was worth it. Many of the earliest scooping tools weren't used for eating at all. Some were used in rituals. Some were used to pour oils or pigments or ashes. In some burials, we find small bowls and shallow dishes laid beside the dead. Not necessarily because they were expected to eat in the afterlife, but because these objects had meaning. They had been touched. Used. Trusted. And when someone mattered, the things they used were laid down with them. Quietly. Without fanfare. The line between spoon and bowl is blurry in the beginning. Some early tools were little more than miniature bowls. Others were more like ladles. Some may have been used both ways. There's no rule that says a scooping tool has to be handheld, or small, or even symmetrical. The only thing that makes something a spoon is the action it performs. If it carries food from vessel to mouth, it qualifies. Even if it's ugly. Even if it spills. In some caves, soot marks on the ceilings tell us that people cooked inside. They used fire, built small hearths, and hung containers over them. We don't know exactly what they cooked, but traces of starch and fat suggest simple stews. And if you make stew, eventually you'll need to serve it. You can drink from the pot, but that doesn't work well if the pot is hot, or heavy, or being shared. So something emerges to help divide and deliver the contents. Not out of civility. Out of practicality. Even in prehistoric camps, the gesture of sharing food becomes central. And with it, the act of serving. A spoon is not just a tool for eating. It's also a tool for giving. For offering. For making sure someone else gets their share. When hands are full or busy or injured, the spoon steps in. Not dramatically. Not with style. Just with quiet efficiency. We don't know what people called these tools. Maybe they had no word for them at all. Maybe they were described by function. The thing for the soup. The curve for the ash. The bone we use in winter. Language was different then. Sparse. Immediate. But the objects themselves tell a story, even if they can't speak. They tell us that someone cared enough to make the same shape more than once. That someone noticed when a certain angle worked better. That someone passed the idea along, not in a lecture, but in a gesture. Here. Use this. It works better. And so the prehistoric scoop passed from one hand to another. Not as invention. Not as revolution. But as routine. It helped the sick. The old. The tired. The ones who couldn't lean forward. The ones who couldn't hold a bowl. The ones who needed help but didn't want to ask for it. These spoons, if we can call them that, are rarely the highlight of a museum display. They're tucked into corners. Listed as utilitarian artifacts. Sometimes mislabeled. Sometimes overlooked. But they tell us something important. That comfort mattered. That ease mattered. That even when life was short and hard and unpredictable, people found ways to make it slightly less so. And in the long, dim corridor of time, that effort accumulates. Slowly. Quietly. Until one day, someone sits down, picks up a spoon, stirs their soup, and doesn't think twice about it. But it all had to start somewhere. And more often than not, it started with a shell. By the time cities began to form, and walls began to rise, and people began drawing lines between what was theirs and what wasn't, the spoon had already been there for quite some time. Not the modern kind, of course. Not stainless steel or neatly stamped or stacked in drawers. But the idea, the shape, the motion, it was already familiar. By then, it had been practiced over fires and in huts, beside rivers and under the open sky. It had been carved and broken and copied and passed on. And when civilization began putting things in order, the spoon, in its own way, was included. Ancient Egypt, for example, was a place that recorded things. Carefully. Systematically. In stone. In ink. In ritual. They recorded grain counts and offerings, star charts and family trees, the names of cats and kings alike. And among the things they took time to preserve, in tombs and temples and homes, were spoons. Carved with care, shaped from wood or ivory or stone, sometimes curved simply, other times in the likeness of birds or flowers or gods. Some had handles like cobras. Others bore the eye of Horus, or the ankh, or lotuses in bloom. Some were flat, others round, others shallow like a leaf cupped in the wind. They were not always meant for eating. Many were used in ceremony, to pour oils, to scoop perfumes, to measure incense. But the shape was familiar. The purpose, recognizably human. Lift, carry, deliver. Nothing dramatic. Just the continuation of a gesture that had already been made for centuries before Egypt ever laid its first brick. In daily life, simpler spoons were used by common people, usually of wood. Not all meals required them, but for broths, gruels, and porridges, they were practical. There were no mass-produced utensils. Each one was shaped by hand, worn by time, and personal. Sometimes they were passed down. Sometimes they were burned for fuel. It's hard to say. Few survive, because most were made of perishable material. But enough ceremonial ones remain to tell us that the form was there. That people recognized its use. That in a society obsessed with order and balance, the spoon fit. The Greeks came later, and they had a complicated relationship with food. On the one hand, they believed in moderation. On the other, they held long, indulgent banquets that included courses with names longer than the meals themselves. They wrote poems about figs. They discussed digestion as part of philosophy. And yet, oddly, they didn't use spoons as we know them all that much. Their meals often involved bread, olives, cheeses, and solid food picked up with hands or scooped with pieces of flatbread. What spoons they had were usually made of bronze or bone and were used for serving rather than individual dining. Still, the shape existed. Shallow, often oval, occasionally with a pointed handle that doubled as a pick or skewer. One end for stirring or serving. The other for spearing olives. Efficient, if not elegant. The spoon here became a kind of dual-purpose tool, practical in a society that prized rhetoric but still had to eat. The Romans, never ones to leave something unadopted if it was remotely useful, borrowed from the Greeks and expanded. They had a word for spoon, cochlear, which they used to describe both the utensil and the spiral shape of a snail shell, from which the earliest versions likely took their form. Roman spoons were often more refined, made of silver or bronze, and were found in both kitchen settings and burial contexts. Some had round bowls and long handles. Others had smaller, sharper ends for shellfish and eggs. They were used for eating, for serving, for tasting sauces, for rituals. They appeared in households across the empire, from villas in the Italian countryside to outposts in Britannia. And they traveled, as the Romans did, carried by merchants, soldiers, scribes. A small piece of civilization, tucked into a satchel, brought from one end of the world to the other. In Roman dining customs, the spoon was more commonly used than the fork, which remained relatively rare for much of antiquity. Fingers still did most of the work. Bread was still the universal helper. But when something was too hot, or too liquid, or simply too refined to grab, the spoon was there. Often unnoticed. Often set aside. But always nearby. It's worth noting that in these early civilizations, the spoon was not standardized. There was no one shape, no single material, no expected size. There were no factory molds or catalogs or sets of 12. Each spoon was slightly different. Shaped by hand. Influenced by the material at hand, the task at hand, and the hand that made it. Some were long and narrow, meant for reaching into deep jars. Others were broad and shallow, meant for quick serving. Some had carvings. Others were plain. Many were both beautiful and practical, though not necessarily because anyone meant them to be. Function and form simply lived side by side. In some cases, the spoon took on symbolic value. It became more than a tool. It became an object of meaning. In religious rites, spoons held sacred substances. In medicine, they delivered measured doses of crushed herbs or wine-soaked bark. In family life, they were sometimes part of dowries or gifts, perhaps because they were useful, perhaps because they were personal. Something that touched the mouth. Something that crossed generations, quietly. Outside of the Mediterranean, the spoon took other paths. In Mesopotamia, for instance, which gave the world writing and bureaucracy and the enduring joy of taxation, spoons were used in temples and homes alike. Clay models survive, alongside tablets that describe feasting and offering. The act of giving food to the gods often involved vessels, some flat, some curved. The idea of lifting and offering, of raising something from one place to another, seems to have carried both spiritual and practical weight. Farther east, in the civilizations of the Indus Valley, evidence is more fragmentary. Some possible spoon-like tools have been found, but their use is harder to determine. Many of their utensils were designed for grinding, mixing, or pouring, rather than individual consumption. Still, the possibility remains that curved tools were in use, especially in a region where lentil stews, porridges, and milk-based dishes were common. But it is in China that we find perhaps the most continuous, documented evolution of the spoon as both utensil and symbol. By the time of the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years ago, bronze spoons were already in use. They appeared in tombs and kitchens, in formal banquets and everyday meals. They were often paired with another tool, the chopstick, which did not replace the spoon but complemented it. While chopsticks were good for lifting solids, the spoon remained essential for broths, rice porridge, and anything that needed a scoop. Chinese spoons often had short handles and deep, rounded bowls. Some were flat-bottomed, allowing them to rest on the table without spilling. Others were elegantly curved. Over time, as porcelain technology developed, spoons were made from that as well, delicate, often white, sometimes painted, but still functional. Chinese dining emphasized balance. Heat and cold. Texture and flavor. The spoon fit into this worldview seamlessly. It didn't dominate the plate, but it made certain dishes possible. And while its design changed over time, its role remained. Even now, modern Chinese spoons retain much of their ancient shape, sturdy, deep, quietly effective. Across these civilizations, the spoon adapted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But with consistency. It reflected the needs of each society, their foods, their customs, their materials. In Egypt, it was ceremonial and symbolic. In Greece, occasional and secondary. In Rome, practical and portable. In China, steady and enduring. It is easy, in hindsight, to look at these tools and try to trace a single line. To imagine a progression. From bone to bronze, from temple to table, from primitive to polished. But the truth is messier. Spoons didn't evolve in a straight path. They arose in many places, in many forms, sometimes connected, sometimes not. Sometimes shaped by necessity. Sometimes by aesthetics. Sometimes by nothing more than the fact that someone had a bit of time and a sharp knife. What they shared, across all these places, was quiet utility. The spoon was not the object of ceremony, but the thing that made the ceremony possible. Not the center of the feast, but the thing that made the soup easier to serve. Not the hero of the household, but the thing you reached for when you needed help. It did not require instruction. It did not need approval. It simply worked. And in a world full of change, of dynasties rising and falling, of borders redrawn, of languages lost and found, the spoon stayed. It remained curved. It remained helpful. It remained, quietly, one of the most persistent shapes in human history. The Middle Ages were long. Longer than most people think. Not one moment, not one mood, but a slow stretch of time that moved across centuries without much hurry. Between the fall of Rome and the rise of printing presses, people lived, and ate, and slept, and built, and prayed, and waited. And through all of that, the spoon remained. It did not remain unchanged, but it did not evolve with urgency. It changed slowly, like most things in that time. The people who used it did not spend their days thinking about it. Most of them did not own one. A spoon was not yet a universal item. It was not something every person had, or expected to have. It was, more often than not, an object of privilege, or at least of personal property. And in a time when most meals were eaten with hands or with bread torn from the loaf and dipped into whatever the pot contained, the spoon stood out as something slightly different. Not grand. But set apart. The nobleman's table was the first place where the spoon took on a new kind of meaning. It was still a tool, but also a marker of wealth, of refinement, of distance from the common bowl. In the great halls of medieval manors and castles, meals were loud and often messy, but they had rules. The rules were not always consistent, but they mattered. And among them was the slow emergence of individual utensils. Knives were often carried. They were tools as much as weapons. Forks had not yet entered fully into daily use. But the spoon, the humble spoon, found its place, slowly, quietly, by the bowl. It was often made of wood. Carved by hand. A little rough, a little worn. But in some cases, it was something more. Pewter. Brass. Occasionally silver. Not polished to a mirror finish, but heavy, cool to the touch, and shaped by someone who had shaped others before. These were not mass-produced objects. Each one had its own slight variation. The curve of the bowl. The taper of the handle. A slight nick here, a small notch there. Some were engraved with initials or family crests. Others were plain. But when a guest sat at table and found a spoon waiting, it meant something. It meant you were expected to use it. It meant someone had counted the places. It meant, in some way, that you were part of the order. That was important in the Middle Ages. Order. It wasn't always achieved, but it was often imagined. Every man in his place. Every task to its owner. Every object where it belonged. And the spoon, simple, narrow, curved, belonged at the table, but only if you had a place at the table. Elsewhere, things were simpler. In cottages and huts, in villages without names, meals were communal. Food came in one pot. Bread was torn and passed. And if a spoon was needed, it was shared. Or carved on the spot. Or not used at all. Fingers sufficed. So did crusts of bread, hardened into scoops. People ate with what they had. They didn't speak of utensils. They spoke of hunger, and warmth, and whether the stew would last the week. For those with means, spoons began to carry symbolic weight. They were given as gifts, at births, at baptisms, sometimes at marriages. They were tokens, not just of use, but of intention. To give a spoon was to say, here is something for your future. It may be plain, it may be small, but it is yours. In some places, a silver spoon given at birth was seen as a blessing. A sign that the child would not go hungry. In others, it was simply practical. A thing the child would grow into. A tool for life. The phrase, born with a silver spoon, has its roots here. Not in wealth alone, but in possession. To be born with a spoon of silver was not only to be rich, but to be remembered. To be expected. To be seen as someone who would eat apart from others, from their own dish, with their own tool. In a world where most people shared everything, and nothing was permanent, that was a statement. But spoons were not always personal. In monasteries, where order took on a different kind of shape, meals were shared in silence. Monks sat side by side, bowls before them, spoons beside those bowls, hands folded until the signal was given. They ate not with pleasure, but with rhythm. Each movement quiet. Each bite controlled. And in that silence, the spoon served another purpose. It kept things steady. It allowed for the meal to continue without interruption. It was a bridge between the bowl and the self, small, plain, necessary. Some monasteries had shared utensils. Others assigned them. Some kept them in drawers, wrapped in cloth. Others left them out, rinsed and dried in the sun. They were not worshipped. But they were part of the rule. And the rule was sacred. Elsewhere, in towns and villages, the spoon came and went. Some families had one. Some had none. Some passed one down. Some carved them when needed. Wood was the most common choice. Easy to find. Easy to shape. Easy to burn when broken. A spoon made from willow or birch might last a year, or a day. If lost, it could be replaced. If stolen, it might be forgotten. There were no brands. No collections. Only the tool, the hand, the bowl. Over time, as trade expanded, other materials entered the scene. Horn. Bone. Even imported metals, when merchants could spare them. The design remained largely the same, a shallow bowl, a narrow handle, but the variety grew. Some spoons became flatter. Some rounder. Some were meant for cooking, others for eating. Some were longer, to reach into deep pots. Some were shorter, for small hands, or for travelers. In kitchens, spoons grew larger. Not for elegance, but for reach. Stirring took strength. Deep pots demanded long arms. And the cooking spoon, though rarely named, became a fixture. It hung from hooks, leaned against walls, waited by the fire. It wasn't admired. It wasn't displayed. But it was used. Every day. In heat and smoke and haste. At markets, spoons were sometimes sold. A craftsman might bring a bundle, freshly carved, still smelling of sap. Buyers would pick them up, weigh them in hand, consider the grain, the bend, the balance. Prices were low. The value was in the use. Few bought spoons as gifts. Fewer still as heirlooms. But every so often, a traveler might carry one in a pouch, tucked beside a knife, wrapped in cloth. Not for display. For need. By the late medieval period, especially in wealthier courts, spoons began to be made in sets. Not matching, not decorative, but consistent. A host might order a dozen. For guests. For formality. For order. Not every guest used them. Some preferred their hands. But the gesture was made. The spoons were laid out. The table was set. And as this happened, rules of etiquette began to emerge. Slowly. Unwritten, at first. Then taught. The spoon was not to be used for meat. It was not for slicing. It was not to be licked clean, nor dropped into the pot, nor wiped on cloth. It was to be held gently. Returned quietly. Not raised too high. Not scraped along the bowl. These rules varied, but they spread. And with them came a new awareness of the spoon, not just as tool, but as signal. Of class. Of polish. Of knowing the way things were done. In literature, the spoon appears rarely. It is too plain. Too familiar. It does not lend itself to poetry. But it exists between the lines. In scenes of kitchens. In memories of childhood. In the margins of larger moments. A servant stirring. A child fed. A soldier resting. A nun tasting broth in a cold stone hall. It is always there, but never loud. Never proud. And so, in the Middle Ages, the spoon held its place. Not as a centerpiece. Not as a marvel. But as a quiet witness. To meals taken alone. To feasts shared with many. To hunger relieved, and sometimes not. To the small routines that made the larger ones bearable. It did not advance quickly. It did not seek innovation. It simply continued. From hand to bowl. From pot to mouth. A small arc. A soft shape. A thing that worked, and so remained. While spoons in Europe followed a quiet, steady path from ritual object to table tool, gaining a handle here, a deeper bowl there, passed between monasteries and manor houses, carved from wood or cast in pewter, their journey in Asia unfolded alongside, but not precisely in step. It was neither imitation nor divergence, but a kind of parallel evolution. The shape was similar. The purpose was familiar. But the surroundings, the customs, the meals themselves, were different enough that the spoon became something else entirely. Not unrecognizable, but distinct. Still a spoon. Still curved. Still for lifting something from a bowl to a mouth. But adapted to fit into meals that followed different rhythms, different textures, and different hands. In ancient China, spoons were already present by the time of the Shang dynasty. That was more than 3,000 years ago. Long before the stirrings of medieval Europe, long before the cities of the West had rebuilt themselves, long before spoons were being engraved with family crests, Chinese households were already using them, not only in temples or tombs, but in kitchens, in markets, in meals eaten at low tables on the ground. They were made of bronze at first. Shaped with care. Some were used for serving. Some for eating. Some were ceremonial. Some were practical. Some, in all likelihood, were both. They didn't look like Western spoons. Not exactly. The handles were shorter. The bowls were deeper. The base was often flat, allowing the spoon to rest without tipping. Some had a gentle hook at the end, not for decoration, but for grip. They weren't made to be elegant. They were made to be useful. And they were. Especially for the kinds of dishes that appeared often on Chinese tables. Congee. Soup. Noodles in broth. Herbal teas. The spoon, as it took shape in China, was not meant to replace the hand. It was meant to work alongside another tool entirely, the chopstick. It's easy to think of the chopstick as replacing the spoon. But that's not quite right. They serve different purposes. Chopsticks are precise. Good for lifting, for turning, for selecting. The spoon, by contrast, is a carrier. A gatherer. It's better for liquid. Better for porridge. Better for things that move on their own when lifted. And so, in Chinese dining, the spoon and the chopstick grew together. They didn't compete. They didn't trade places. They sat side by side. One for solids. One for broth. A balance, not a replacement. Porcelain spoons appeared later. During the Han Dynasty, ceramics advanced to the point where household utensils could be shaped with more detail, more regularity, and more delicacy. Porcelain wasn't just for teacups or vases. It was also for the spoon. These spoons were often white. Cool to the touch. Some were painted with blue patterns. Some were left plain. The shape remained mostly the same, deep bowl, short handle, curved just enough to sit in the palm. And when someone lifted a spoon of this kind, there was a quiet efficiency to the movement. It didn't wobble. It didn't spill. It didn't ask for attention. It did what it was supposed to do, and then it rested, ready for the next scoop. Over time, this style of spoon became part of Chinese food culture at every level. From palace banquets to street-side breakfasts. From wedding feasts to solitary bowls of rice gruel in winter. It was not a sign of status. It was simply what worked. And because it worked, it stayed. Not unchanged, but consistent. Generation after generation. Sometimes heavier. Sometimes lighter. Sometimes made of wood. Sometimes of ceramic. But always there. Always curved. Always doing its job. In Korea, the spoon followed a different path. Similar in function, but with its own features. Korean meals, especially those centered around rice, soups, and stews, demanded a utensil that could handle both weight and heat. And so the Korean spoon became longer. Thinner. Often made of metal. Sometimes with sharp, geometric lines. A shape that looked, to outsiders, more modern than ancient. But the roots ran deep. These spoons, called sutgarak, were usually paired with chopsticks, just as in China, but the role was more central. Korean cuisine includes a variety of hot broths and thick stews, often served boiling, with ingredients that settle and hide beneath the surface. The spoon became the main instrument for reaching them. Chopsticks might lift banchan, the small side dishes, but the spoon did the heavy lifting. It brought warmth, heft, volume. The shape reflected that need. And so did the material. Wood was common in early centuries, but as metalworking improved, brass and later stainless steel became the norm. Cool to the touch, easy to clean, durable enough to last a lifetime. In some homes, a spoon was given to a child as a keepsake. Not engraved. Not decorative. Just well made. Something that would still be there when they were grown. In traditional Korean table etiquette, the spoon is held in the right hand. It is not used simultaneously with the chopstick. One tool, one purpose, one motion at a time. Meals are eaten slowly, deliberately. Each scoop placed with care. It is not a fast utensil. It doesn't slice. It doesn't pierce. But it holds. And in that holding, it serves. Meanwhile, in Japan, the story was different again. Japanese cuisine evolved with a strong focus on seasonal ingredients, subtle flavors, and visual presentation. Many dishes were bite-sized, designed to be picked up gently, to be eaten whole. Chopsticks became dominant, almost exclusive. They were precise, efficient, graceful. The spoon, in many settings, simply wasn't needed. It wasn't absent, but it wasn't expected. It appeared when porridge was served, or when thick miso soup needed lifting, or in dishes that leaned more toward the Chinese or Korean style. But it was never central. It remained in the background. Quiet. Selective. Instead of relying on a spoon, Japanese meals often used the bowl itself. People drank directly from the edge. Not in haste. Not because spoons were unavailable. But because the design of the meal allowed for it. Broths were light, often clear, and served in small portions. Ingredients were balanced in size. The architecture of the dish, if one can call it that, made the spoon less necessary. Still, ceramic spoons did exist. Usually in more casual settings. At ramen shops. In home kitchens. In meals that welcomed influence from outside. The spoon was there. Just not essential. Not expected. Not revered. But when it appeared, it looked much like its Chinese cousin, deep, curved, short-handled. Made to rest neatly in the hand, or hook gently over the bowl. Functional. Modest. And appreciated, if not celebrated. Across Southeast Asia, spoons took yet more forms. In places like Thailand and Vietnam, where rice and noodle soups are central to the cuisine, the spoon became indispensable. Usually paired with chopsticks, it was used to gather broth, balance noodles, scoop herbs and toppings. In these regions, the spoon is not optional. It is active. It moves constantly between bowl and mouth, between chopstick and hand. It works hard. And the shape reflects that. Broad, flat-bottomed, slightly upturned. Light in weight. Easy to hold. Made from ceramic, metal, or plastic. Whatever's available. Whatever lasts. In all of these places, the spoon did not spread from a single source. It wasn't imported from Rome. It didn't arrive on a ship. It emerged independently. Shaped by local food, local hands, local needs. It's easy to forget how much the design of a spoon is tied to what it touches. A thick stew asks for something different than a clear soup. A porridge needs more depth than a broth. A hot dish needs a longer handle than a cool one. There is no universal spoon. Only local answers to the same quiet question: how do we carry this to our mouth without spilling it? What unites these spoons across Asia is their lack of showmanship. They are not decorative. They are not symbolic. They are not gathered into curated sets with matching forks and knives. They exist to be used. They are shaped by use. And their success is measured not in how they look, but in how little they interrupt the meal. A good spoon, in these cultures, is one that disappears. One that lets the food be tasted. One that stays balanced. One that does not get in the way. And yet, there is care. There is attention. There is pride in a spoon that lasts, or that fits just right in the hand, or that reminds someone of a parent, or a grandmother, or a time before plastic. There is quiet memory in these shapes. Not because they are grand. But because they are close. Because they touch the mouth. Because they were always there. Today, many of these spoon shapes remain. They are mass-produced now, often in factories far from the places they first appeared. But the design has changed little. A Chinese porcelain spoon bought today looks much like one from centuries ago. A Korean metal spoon, slim and strong, fits neatly into a drawer beside its ancestors. A Vietnamese soup spoon, curved and simple, does the same work now as it did in the time of market stalls and courtyard kitchens. These spoons may not be part of global museum collections. They may not appear in books about royal silverware. But they are used. Every day. In quiet homes and crowded cafes. In early breakfasts and late-night meals. They are lifted. They are rinsed. They are set down. They are picked up again. In Asia, the spoon did not copy. It did not follow. It found its own shape. Not because it needed to be different. But because the food asked for it. Because the hands that held it asked for it. Because sometimes, the curve of a spoon says more about a place than its monuments. And in that way, the spoon became not just a tool, but a reflection. Of taste. Of habit. Of comfort. A small, curved answer to the enduring question of how to eat well, without fuss, and without hurry. By the time the Renaissance arrived, the spoon had already seen many centuries come and go. It had scooped stews beside cooking fires. It had measured incense in stone temples. It had passed through the hands of nobles, peasants, monks, and merchants, often without ceremony and almost always without praise. It was familiar. It was useful. It was not yet elegant. But it was there. And as the Renaissance began to reshape how people thought about art, science, and society, the spoon, small and quiet as it was, began to change too. Not in function, but in meaning. The Renaissance was not a single moment. It did not begin on a Tuesday. It did not arrive all at once or in the same way for everyone. It crept in gradually, through books, through trade, through invention, through an increasing sense that the world was larger, and possibly more orderly, than it had seemed before. People began to measure things with more care. They noticed proportion. They sought symmetry. They observed the natural world and tried to record it not as myth, but as mechanism. This attention to detail spread to everything, from paintings to gardens to clothing to the table itself. And so, slowly, the table changed. Meals had always been social, but now they became performances. A host did not simply feed guests. He arranged the experience. The cloth was chosen with care. The vessels matched. The food followed courses. And the utensils, once rough, borrowed, or absent altogether, became expected. The spoon, once tucked into a sleeve or handed down the table when needed, began to find a fixed place at each setting. Not only because it was practical, but because it was part of the display. In noble households, silver became common. Not for everyone. Not in every region. But in cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris, silverware became a sign of refinement. Owning a set, matched, polished, engraved, was a way of showing not just wealth, but culture. The spoon's bowl became more regular in shape. The handle straighter. Some were adorned with delicate patterns. Some bore coats of arms. Some were commissioned in groups, 12, 24, even more. No longer a single possession. Now a part of a whole. Workshops emerged to meet this demand. Silversmiths, previously busy with chalices and medallions, now produced spoons by the dozens. Each piece stamped, filed, balanced. A spoon was no longer just something to eat with. It was something to choose. Something to polish. Something to store in boxes lined with velvet. Something that could be inherited. But not every spoon was silver. In more modest households, spoons continued to be made of wood, brass, tin. They were functional. Often plain. But even here, the influence of refinement began to show. Shapes became more consistent. Handles more symmetrical. The idea of what a spoon should look like took hold. It was no longer just what worked. It was what matched. What fit in with the table. This was the beginning of standardization. The curve of the bowl. The length of the handle. The weight in the hand. These details, once the domain of improvisation, became matters of craft. Not mass production, at least not yet, but shared expectation. When someone picked up a spoon in 1550, it felt more familiar to someone in another city than it would have a century earlier. And slowly, ideas began to form about which spoons were used for which foods. Etiquette manuals began to appear. Books explaining how to sit, how to serve, how to behave. Not because people had suddenly become more polite, but because they had begun to record what politeness looked like. One such book might advise not to place the spoon back in the communal dish after using it. Another might remind the reader to keep the spoon on the edge of the plate, not in the bowl. Still others described the proper way to hold a spoon, balanced, quiet, not raised too high, not waved in the air to emphasize a point. These instructions may seem small, but they mattered. They signaled a shift. The spoon was no longer just about moving food. It was about moving through society. About knowing the steps. About appearing composed. It had become part of a larger choreography, in which every gesture carried meaning. In France, this movement was particularly strong. At court, meals were spectacles. Courses followed one another in careful order. Dishes were arranged not only for taste but for symmetry. The spoon joined the knife at each setting. The fork was still a curiosity, not yet fully accepted. But the spoon, by contrast, had become essential. It was used not only to eat, but to serve, to ladle, to taste, to offer. In England, silver spoons became popular as baptismal gifts. A child might receive one with their name engraved. It was not a toy. It was a token. A reminder of family. Of place. Of the future. This practice, which had roots in earlier centuries, became more widespread. And so the phrase, born with a silver spoon, came to mean not just wealth, but a kind of gentle certainty. A life with fewer sharp edges. At the same time, cooking itself became more refined. Recipes were recorded. Ingredients weighed. Measurements standardized. And the spoon became part of that too. No longer just for eating. Now for measuring. A teaspoon. A tablespoon. Not exact at first. Not universal. But a step in that direction. In professional kitchens, larger spoons were used to stir, to skim, to serve. These were not decorative. They were tools. Worn smooth by use. But even here, the shape had become familiar. The bowl. The handle. The arc. It was all settling into something recognizably modern. In wealthier homes, spoon sets began to appear. One for soup. One for dessert. One for serving. One for sugar. The differences were sometimes slight. But they were there. And with each new distinction, the spoon became more than just one thing. It became many things. Each with a role. Each with a name. Of course, most people still had just one. Or none. Or used whatever was available. In villages and farms, the spoon remained close to its origins. carved from local wood. Shared between siblings. Rinsed in cold water. Left to dry on the windowsill. But even there, the idea of refinement drifted in. Slowly. Through stories. Through travelers. Through objects passed from hand to hand. And so the spoon entered modernity not with a leap, but with a glide. It did not change suddenly. It did not need to. Its shape was already right. All that changed was how people looked at it. What they expected of it. Where they placed it on the table. How they cleaned it. How they used it when guests were watching. In this way, the spoon mirrored the age. The Renaissance was not about creating the new from nothing. It was about re-seeing what already was. About shaping it. Balancing it. Refining it. And in that spirit, the spoon became not just an object, but a gesture. A sign that one had arrived. Or was trying to. Even the act of eating changed. Meals became longer. More courses. More discussion. The spoon became part of the rhythm. It moved slowly from plate to mouth. It paused when a guest spoke. It rested when the table grew quiet. It gleamed in candlelight. It clinked softly against the edge of porcelain. It was no longer just a thing to hold. It was a thing to be seen holding. But still, it worked. That never changed. For all the ceremony, the engraving, the velvet-lined drawers, the spoon remained what it had always been, a small, curved tool that made food easier to carry. It didn't need praise. It didn't ask for notice. It was content to help. And in the end, that is what refinement is. Not the abandonment of the ordinary, but the quiet elevation of it. The belief that even simple things can be made a little better. A little more balanced. A little more beautiful. And in that belief, the spoon found its place, not at the center, but close enough to be remembered. By the time the first steam engines hissed their way down iron rails, the spoon was already old. It had existed in palaces and huts, temples and taverns. It had been carved by hand, polished by use, passed from generation to generation, often with little attention paid to its design. It had fed kings and children and sick mothers and tired workers, and it had done so with a quiet kind of dignity, the sort that comes not from elegance, but from endurance. Then the machines came, and everything changed. But not all at once. The Industrial Revolution, like so many revolutions, began not with noise, but with repetition. A wheel turning. A pump lifting. A loom weaving. And eventually, a press stamping. When machines learned to make things the same way every time, spoons changed. Not because anyone demanded it, but because now they could. Uniformity was no longer the domain of the wealthy. Precision was no longer a sign of class. A spoon that matched its neighbor exactly could now be bought by someone who had never owned one before. Factories began producing spoons by the hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. They were no longer made one at a time, each shaped by a craftsman's hand and eye. Now they were pressed from sheets of metal, trimmed, polished, packed into boxes, and shipped out in wagons and boats and, later, trucks. The materials changed too. Steel replaced silver. Nickel replaced brass. Tin was used for a time, then replaced by stronger alloys. These spoons didn't shine as brightly. They didn't hold the warmth of a hand-carved wooden handle. But they lasted. And they were affordable. And they worked. Suddenly, the spoon was no longer a marker of refinement. It was a household item. Not a gift, not an heirloom, not a tool to be admired, but a standard. A fixture. A thing that everyone had, and that no one thought much about. It appeared in drawers and cupboards, in lunch pails and factory cafeterias, in railroad cars and boarding houses. It traveled in satchels, tucked beside knives and forks. It waited in tin cups, rattled in sinks, dried on towels. It was a new kind of spoon. Not made for ceremony. Made for use. This was the great flattening of the utensil world. Before the industrial age, a spoon might have said something about you. Where you lived. Who your parents were. How many rooms your house had. Now, it mostly said that you needed to eat soup. And for many people, that was enough. In catalogs and department stores, spoons appeared in sets. Tablespoons. Teaspoons. Dessert spoons. Serving spoons. Not ornate, but categorized. You could buy them in packs of 6. 12. 24. Sometimes wrapped in brown paper. Sometimes tucked into molded plastic trays. They came with flatware sets, matching forks, matching knives. Sometimes with names. Sometimes without. For those just beginning a household, a set of spoons was one of the first things to buy. Alongside a kettle. A broom. A basin. It didn't need to be beautiful. Just serviceable. The curve needed to be even. The handle smooth. The weight acceptable. These were not matters of taste. They were matters of function. And when the function was met, the matter was closed. Yet not everyone was content with function. Even in an age of machines, some wanted decoration. So certain spoons were given flourishes. Swirls on the handles. Floral patterns. Raised initials. Some had ridges or ridged backs. Some were silver-plated. A thin layer, barely there, but enough to shine. Enough to suggest refinement without requiring it. Enough to echo a past most people no longer remembered, but still found comforting. As the middle class grew, and domestic life became something to shape rather than endure, the spoon settled deeper into its role as part of the table. Not the centerpiece. But an expected presence. Laid beside plates at dinner. Resting in bowls of pudding. Stirring sugar into tea. Feeding babies. Helping sick relatives. Scooping medicine. Making quiet circles in cups long after the conversation had ended. In schools, spoons were packed into lunchboxes. In military camps, they were standard issue. Soldiers received one with their kit. Sometimes aluminum. Sometimes steel. Light, durable, impersonal. It wasn't yours. But it was necessary. It could stir coffee. Scoop beans. Open cans. Scrape. Tap. Signal. If lost, it could be replaced. But many kept theirs anyway. Bent. Scarred. Stamped with initials. A spoon that had gone where they had gone. Seen what they had seen. Used in silence. Rinsed in cold water. Wrapped in cloth. Tucked away. In hospitals, spoons became tools of care. Nurses fed patients with them. Measured medicine with them. Used them to test. To check. To comfort. The size mattered. So did the curve. So did the edge. A spoon that was too sharp might hurt. Too large might spill. Too small might frustrate. So designs adjusted. Gently. Quietly. Handles widened. Bowls deepened. Angles softened. It was not innovation in the bold sense. It was refinement by necessity. In restaurants, the spoon became part of the place setting. Whether cloth napkin or paper, linen tablecloth or laminated tray, the spoon was placed, expected, used, cleared, washed, and returned. Often without notice. Often with only the sound of its bowl touching the bottom of a cup, or the soft scrape against ceramic. It did not demand attention. But it was always there. Some spoons, especially in diners and lunch counters, grew heavier. Stainless steel, thick and dull. Durable. Designed to survive hundreds of uses. Others became lighter. Thin, disposable, made of plastic. Designed to be used once, then thrown away. The shape remained the same. The purpose too. But the life of the spoon had shortened. Some now lasted only minutes. Stirred one coffee. Lifted 3 bites of yogurt. Dropped into a bin. This, too, was part of the industrial story. Convenience. Speed. Quantity. Where once a spoon had been carved for a child, and used for years, now they came by the boxful. White, gray, black. Smooth. Identical. Forgettable. But effective. And for a long time, that was enough. In kitchens, measuring spoons became more precise. Recipes, once written in vague terms, a spoonful, a dash, a pinch, now called for teaspoons. Tablespoons. Level, packed, heaping. Plastic sets hung from hooks. Stainless sets nested inside drawers. Measuring became methodical. The spoon became a unit. No longer just a vessel, now a standard. A measure of flavor. A step toward consistency. Children learned to eat with spoons before they could hold pencils. Before they could speak full sentences. They were given rounded spoons. Soft edges. Colorful plastic. Safe to bite. Easy to grip. They dropped them. Picked them up. Dropped them again. And still, the spoon remained. Patient. Washable. Durable. They're in the high chair. They're in the diaper bag. They're on the floor. And yet, for all this, the spoon remained strangely invisible. It had become so common, so expected, that it passed unnoticed. People spoke of forks. They debated knives. But the spoon rarely made headlines. It wasn't new. It wasn't controversial. It didn't require etiquette classes or safety warnings. It just was. A curve. A handle. A shape so familiar it barely registered. But that familiarity was its strength. In a world that was changing fast, machines roaring, cities growing, people moving, the spoon offered something still. Something ordinary. Something reliable. It was one of the few things that remained more or less the same, even as everything else moved forward. A spoon in 1890 was not so different from a spoon in 1950. Or 2020. It may have come from a different factory. Been made of a different metal. Cost a few cents more. But in the hand, in the bowl, it was the same. And so, the spoon entered the modern age not with revolution, but with repetition. It became part of daily life not through ceremony, but through use. It stirred morning coffee. Scooped lunchtime soup. Dipped into evening ice cream. It helped taste, serve, feed, comfort. Not once, but over and over again. That is the story of the industrial spoon. Not glamorous. Not heroic. But faithful. A shape repeated until it became invisible. A tool used so often that it stopped feeling like a tool. A part of the background. A fixture of the table. A measure of stability in a world that had grown faster than anyone had expected. The spoon today is no longer carved beside a fire. It is not hammered by a village smith. It is not handed down from one generation to the next with a quiet explanation and a name engraved on the handle. And yet, it is everywhere. It slips into our lives unnoticed. It waits in drawers. It rests in cups. It clinks softly in cereal bowls. It travels in lunch bags. It sits quietly at the center of meals, never announcing itself, never demanding a moment of attention. It is present not through ceremony or heritage, but through habit. The spoon, in the modern age, has become something else, not a tool of privilege, not even a tool of need, but a background constant. Familiar. Ubiquitous. Unquestioned. In most households, spoons do not arrive alone. They come in sets. Wrapped in packaging, stacked inside boxes, shaped not by hand but by machines, pressed and polished until each one looks just like the last. Most people do not choose spoons individually. They choose them as part of a group, matched to forks and knives, grouped by style or brand or budget. Some are heavy. Some are light. Some have a faint sheen. Some have a mirror polish. Some are plain. Some have a pattern on the handle. Few are noticed for long. They live in drawers. In containers labeled utensils. In dividers with compartments. Some are used every day. Others are saved for guests. Some are favorites for no particular reason, just the right size, or the right weight, or the one that happens to be clean. Others are ignored, left behind in the drawer, their handles just a little too short, their bowls a little too deep, their edges a little too sharp. They are not defective. Just less welcome. Their time will come, eventually. When the others are dirty. When someone else is setting the table. When need outweighs preference. Outside the home, spoons appear in restaurants, in cafes, in offices, in hospitals, in schools. They are part of place settings, usually aligned with quiet intention. Placed to the right of the plate. Above the bowl. Beside the cup. They are polished before being presented. Collected after use. Washed. Reused. Reintroduced. Some are elegant, heavy, cold to the touch. Others are lighter, simpler, more practical. Few are admired. But all are used. Then there are the disposable ones. Made of plastic. White. Gray. Sometimes black. Found in bins by coffee stations. Wrapped in plastic sleeves next to packets of sugar and creamer. Given with takeout orders. Tossed into bags. Expected to last through a meal, or a few bites. Nothing more. They are not designed to endure. They are not meant to matter. But they carry soup. They stir coffee. They scoop rice. They serve. Briefly. Then they are gone. Their lightness makes them forgettable. Their ubiquity makes them invisible. And yet, they represent a shift. A spoon that is not meant to be kept is a new idea. For most of history, spoons were few. Often personal. Sometimes the only one in a home. Now, there are spoons that no one claims. That no one misses. That no one washes. They are used and discarded. One meal. One gesture. One moment of use. Then silence. Plastic spoons come in boxes of hundreds. Sold for parties. For picnics. For school lunches. For offices. Their convenience is their appeal. But convenience, like most things, has a cost. They pile up in bins. In landfills. In oceans. They drift from sight, but not from consequence. And so, gradually, people have begun to notice. Not the spoons themselves, but their shadow. Their trail. Their number. Efforts have been made to replace them. With compostable versions. With bamboo. With starch-based polymers. With spoons that claim to dissolve, or degrade, or disappear. Still, the plastic spoon remains. It is cheap. It is available. It is easy. And those three things, in the modern world, are difficult to overcome. Elsewhere, the spoon has taken on new shapes. Measuring spoons. Long-handled bar spoons. Baby spoons. Spoons with built-in straws. Travel spoons that fold. Camping spoons made of titanium. Spoons designed for one purpose, one audience, one use. Each slightly different in shape. Each solving a very particular problem. But still, at their core, still recognizably the same. A handle. A bowl. A curve. The ancient gesture of lifting something toward the mouth, unchanged. Digital spoons now exist. Spoons that weigh ingredients as they scoop. Spoons with sensors. With buttons. With screens. Some are designed for kitchens. Some for science labs. Others are novelties. Experiments. Concepts. They work. But they do not feel like spoons. Not exactly. Not in the hand. Not in the drawer. Not at the table. Elsewhere, spoons have become part of culture in different ways. In sports, a wooden spoon is the metaphorical award for finishing last. In music, spoons are played as percussion instruments. In symbolism, they appear in phrases, born with a silver spoon, not enough spoons, the spoon theory. In literature, they are rarely centerpieces, but they are there. Stirring porridge. Dipping into tea. Resting beside a saucer. In the kitchen, spoons still measure. Tablespoon. Teaspoon. These are not precise scientific units, though they try to be. A tablespoon in one country may not be the same as in another. A heaping spoonful means one thing to one cook, another to someone else. But the idea remains. A spoon as a measure. A spoon as a guide. A spoon as a standard. Soft, rounded, human-sized. Unlike scales or graduated cylinders, the spoon remains intuitive. The right amount. Or close enough. In childhood, the spoon is often the first utensil learned. A plastic spoon, rounded, easy to grip. It spills often. It ends up on the floor. But it introduces something basic. Food can be moved. Food can be directed. The hand can guide. The bowl can wait. The child learns to scoop. To lift. To balance. Eventually to succeed. The spoon is part of that process. Part of growth. Part of mess. Part of learning. And later, near the end of life, the spoon often returns. Not always. But often. When hands are less steady. When food is softer. When hunger returns in quieter forms. The spoon becomes a helper again. Not a symbol. Not a trophy. Just something that works. Something that doesn't ask for strength. Something familiar. Between those two ends, the spoon travels through life quietly. It feeds. It stirs. It serves. It cleans up the last bit from the bowl. It holds just enough. Not too much. Not too little. Something that can be swallowed. Something that fits. The spoon is not ambitious. It does not do more than it should. It does not multitask. It does one thing, well. In modern homes, some spoons are kept aside. The good ones. The ones with silver. Or history. Or sentiment. Used for holidays. For guests. For moments when the table matters more. These spoons may not be better in shape or weight. But they carry something else. Memory. Association. They belong to someone. They came from somewhere. They have been held by hands no longer here. These are the spoons that are polished before use. That are wrapped and stored. That are not forgotten. Then there are the odd spoons. The one from a vacation. The one with a state name. The one from a wedding favor. The one too small to use, but too unusual to throw away. They live in drawers. In boxes. In back corners. They are not used often. But they are noticed. Occasionally. There are also lost spoons. Left behind. In cafes. In parks. In bags. Spoons that vanish. No one grieves them. But they leave a gap. A set with one missing. A drawer that feels unbalanced. A cereal bowl that doesn't feel quite right. And then there are favorite spoons. No reason. Just right. The one that stirs coffee best. That feels best in the hand. That scoops just the right amount. That clinks at just the right angle. No one knows why. But it's the one we reach for. Again and again. Until it bends. Or disappears. Or is replaced by another. Just as quietly. All of this, the plastic, the metal, the memory, it adds up to something. Not a story of invention. But a story of presence. The spoon is not an innovation. It is a companion. It does not mark change. It survives it. Adapts to it. Disappears into it. Until it is simply part of the moment. That is the modern spoon. Not a relic. Not a revolution. Just a curve that has lasted this long, and will likely last longer still. The spoon, for most of its life, has not asked to mean anything. It has not postured. It has not declared itself. It has not asked to be engraved into crests or cited in poetry or used in metaphor. It has always been too practical for that. Too curved. Too quiet. Too focused on the small, repeated task of helping someone bring food to their mouth. But over time, even the most modest things begin to gather meanings they never asked for. They become symbols not because they try to, but because we live beside them long enough for them to slip, almost unnoticed, into our language, into our customs, into our stories. The spoon is no exception. It begins, perhaps, with the simple fact that spoons are one of the first objects we put into the hands of a child. Not a toy. Not a gift. But a tool. Soft-edged, light, often made of plastic, sometimes brightly colored, sometimes bent slightly for ease. It is not handed over with ceremony. There is no formal moment. It just appears, on a high chair tray, next to a small bowl, beside fingers still learning to grasp. And slowly, over days and weeks, the hand closes around it. The grip tightens. The wrist moves. The food falls. Again and again. Then one day, it doesn't. The food reaches the mouth. The spoon lingers, just long enough to register success. Then it is dropped again. But the moment stays. There is something in that gesture, small, uncelebrated, invisible to everyone except the one who watches it happen every day, that begins to form the emotional life of the spoon. Not just a utensil. A step. A milestone. A sign that coordination is arriving. That control is emerging. That food can be self-delivered. That the body is learning to manage its own nourishment. It is not language. It is not walking. But it is close. And because it comes early, it stays. The memory of the spoon lingers in family photos, in quiet routines, in faded Tupperware, in drawers of things kept for future grandchildren. It becomes part of what it means to grow up, even if it's never spoken aloud. Later, the spoon shows up again. Not as teacher, but as helper. In hospitals. In care homes. In bedrooms when someone is too tired to sit at a table. When meals are not meals, but efforts. When hunger is not sharp, but slow. The spoon becomes a kind of bridge again, between what is needed and what can still be done. It holds medicine. It stirs broth. It moves carefully, at someone else's pace. Not because it has changed. But because its purpose is always to assist. Not to lead. Not to challenge. Just to help. And perhaps this is where its symbolic life begins in earnest. In this role. In this quiet patience. Because people begin to see it as something more than a tool. They begin to use it as a measure of energy. A metaphor. A way of describing what they have left. The spoon theory emerges, not from linguistics, not from anthropology, but from life with chronic illness. A way to explain limits. To count energy not in minutes or steps or calories, but in spoons. Each one a unit. A finite resource. Given at the beginning of the day. Spent, deliberately or not. On getting dressed. On answering email. On standing in the shower. On making a phone call. Once gone, they are gone. The spoon becomes a way to say, I am tired, without having to explain why. I cannot come, without sounding careless. This costs me, without naming the price. In this way, the spoon becomes a form of empathy. A shared language. A small object that carries more than its shape would suggest. Not imposed from above, not offered as a symbol by institutions or traditions, but chosen from below. From those who needed something ordinary enough to feel real, and soft enough not to demand attention. It is not the only symbol the spoon has become. In some cultures, a silver spoon is still given to newborns. Not because it will be used, necessarily, but because it stands for something. For care. For continuity. For a future that includes nourishment. To be born with a silver spoon means something more than wealth. It means being expected. Being accounted for. Being part of a lineage that plans ahead. The spoon is not currency. It is not property. It is promise. That food will be there. That meals will be shared. That hands will help, at least for a while. Elsewhere, the spoon is used to mark failure. The wooden spoon given in sports for the team that finishes last. Not as shame, exactly, but as acknowledgement. You played. You showed up. You did not win. But you ate. You participated. You were part of it. The spoon, even when symbolic of loss, is not cruel. It is not a weapon. It is a presence. A token. A way of saying, you were included. Even if only as a footnote. In music, spoons are used as instruments. Not designed for it, but adopted. Clacked together in rhythm. Held against the leg. Tapped and clicked and shaken. In some traditions, they are part of folk music. In others, a form of improvisation. The sound is light. Repetitive. Subtle. Like the object itself, the music they make is rarely the center. But it supports the rest. In art, spoons are rare subjects. They appear in still life paintings. Reflections in polished silver. Resting against a cup. Shaped by light. More often than not, they are part of the background. But even there, they matter. They give proportion. Scale. They hint at the presence of people. Of meals. Of time passing. In this way, the spoon becomes almost a narrative tool. Not the story, but the suggestion that a story is nearby. And then there are dreams. Not literal dreams. But ambitions. Aspirations. The spoon appears even here, in quiet phrases. People stir the pot. They are told not to. Others spoon-feed information, too gently, too completely. Some are accused of losing their spoon, as if the capacity to function had slipped away like an untethered utensil floating in soup. The language absorbs the object. The object becomes an action. The action becomes a condition. It is difficult to say when the spoon stopped being merely practical and started to be metaphorical. It likely never did so all at once. More likely, its symbolism grew slowly, as most do. Not through declarations, but through repetition. Through being present in moments that mattered, not because the spoon itself was important, but because it was there, in the room, on the table, in the hand, while something else happened. While someone grew. Or struggled. or healed, or failed, or changed. And because it was there, and always had been, it became a way to talk about what was happening. A shorthand. A stand-in. A familiar shape into which meaning could be poured. Gently. Quietly. Until the meaning, like the spoon, became part of the routine. In some homes, the favorite spoon is not the one that matches the others. It is not the newest. It is not the most expensive. It is the one that feels right. That rests comfortably in the hand. That holds the right amount of yogurt. That stirs coffee without spilling. That somehow makes the act of eating feel just slightly easier. It is not symbolic in the grand sense. It does not stand for justice or hope or freedom. But it means something. Even if that something is never quite named. Sometimes it is only after a person is gone that their spoon becomes symbolic. Not intentionally. It is simply found in a drawer. Used again. Noticed for the first time. The way the handle curves. The slight bend in the stem. The wear on the edges. And suddenly, it carries more than food. It carries memory. Not dramatic memory. Not narrative. Just presence. Just repetition. The knowledge that this spoon touched that person's mouth more times than anyone counted. That it survived their mornings, their meals, their routines. And now it is here. Waiting. In this way, the spoon becomes a keeper of the unremarkable. A container for all the things that happen quietly. Hunger. Care. Routine. Return. It does not commemorate. It simply continues. And in doing so, it gathers meaning. Even when made of plastic. Even when part of a disposable set. Even when mass-produced in a factory far away. Even then, the spoon retains its shape. Its gesture. Its presence. A curve. A handle. A quiet movement from the bowl to the lips. Again. And again. Symbolism does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it sits in a drawer for decades before anyone notices. Sometimes, it appears in the hand of a child. Or in the hand of someone very old. Sometimes, it rests in the middle of a table no one has cleared. Sometimes, it floats in a cup of tea gone cold. Sometimes, it is tucked into a lunchbox and never comes back. But it is there. And has been. And likely will be. Not because the spoon asked for meaning. But because we gave it. Slowly. Softly. Over time. When something has been close to us for a very long time, it becomes harder to see. It no longer stands out. It no longer seems to need explanation. It becomes part of the background, part of the routine, part of the furniture of daily life. The spoon is one of those things. It is not glamorous. It is not powerful. It has no sharp edge, no weighty handle, no posture of importance. It does not dazzle with design. It does not change with fashion. And yet, it remains. It has remained through centuries of change, through war and peace, through empire and collapse, through the rise of cities, through the collapse of traditions, through invention after invention that claimed to alter human life in some fundamental way. The spoon did not need to claim anything. It simply stayed. Quietly. Reliably. Within reach. It is a small thing. A tool shaped not to impress, but to help. A curve at the end of a handle. Nothing more. But in that curve is a remarkable kind of endurance. A kind of humility. A kind of patience. It does not offer speed. It does not offer precision. It offers something slower. Something older. Something that says, I will carry this for you. Gently. Without spilling. In a world that has learned to praise what is new, what is fast, what is bold, the spoon offers none of that. It has not reinvented itself. It has not tried to. It has not become smarter, or sharper, or sleeker. It has remained mostly the same. And in that sameness, there is something rare. Something calming. Something that asks nothing from us except to notice, perhaps, how much it has done without asking anything in return. At the dinner table, the spoon does not lead the eye. It is not the first thing we reach for when we set the table. It is not the centerpiece. But when it is missing, we notice. When soup is served, or rice, or pudding, or tea, or porridge, or broth, the spoon becomes necessary. Not dramatically. Not urgently. Just obviously. Naturally. As if it were always meant to be there. And perhaps it was. It is possible that someone listening now has a favorite spoon. Not because it was chosen with care, but because it was chosen over time. The one that feels most right in the hand. The one that holds just enough. The one with the slightly worn handle. The one that stirs quietly. That scoops without spilling. That rests well against the edge of the bowl. That somehow becomes the first one you reach for when the drawer opens, even if you don't know why. There are spoons that come from weddings, from parents, from long-closed diners, from airplane meals, from hospital trays, from camping trips, from flea markets, from drawer bottoms no one has cleared out in years. They are not collected. They are kept. Not for their value, but for their presence. Because they have been there. Because they have served. Because they have become part of the rhythm of life in ways too small to name. There is a kind of honor in being useful. Not in a grand way. Not in a way that demands applause. But in a way that simply works. Every time. Without needing instruction. Without needing improvement. The spoon holds that kind of honor. It is not noticed. But it is needed. And that, in the end, is enough. We have looked at the spoon in many places. In caves and temples. In courts and kitchens. In monasteries and markets. In workshops and warehouses. In homes and hospitals. It has been carved, cast, stamped, pressed, polished, forgotten, remembered. It has been made of bone, wood, metal, ivory, porcelain, plastic, glass. It has been wrapped in cloth. Dropped in bags. Buried in graves. Hung on walls. Tossed into bins. It has taken many shapes. But always the same idea. A curve. A scoop. A motion from one place to another. It is a motion so old that we do not question it. So familiar that we do not see it. And yet, it is part of us. Part of how we eat. Part of how we care for one another. Part of how we begin and how we end. From the first spoonful of mashed peas to the last spoonful of broth, the spoon is with us. Not because it is significant. But because it is sufficient. There is no statue to the spoon. No museum of spoons, though perhaps there should be. No monument carved in its likeness. No national holiday. And still, it remains. Every drawer. Every table. Every meal. There are places where forks are not used. Where knives are uncommon. But there are very few places where the spoon has no place at all. Even if it is called by another name. Even if it is shaped differently. Even if it is used only now and then. The spoon persists. Perhaps the reason the spoon endures is because it expects so little. It does not demand force. It does not reshape what it holds. It carries gently. It adapts. It does not cut. It does not pierce. It does not argue. It simply lifts. And carries. And lowers. In a time when tools are often judged by what they can conquer, the spoon reminds us of another kind of work, the work of support. The work of delivery. The work of presence. And perhaps that is why, even now, it is hard to imagine it going away. The materials may change. The shapes may shift. The names may vary. But the need remains. The need to carry. The need to serve. The need to make something easier. Something warmer. Something more gentle. There will always be something that needs scooping. Stirring. Holding. Serving. There will always be soup. And oatmeal. And tea. And medicine. And melted ice cream. And first meals. And last meals. And all the meals in between. And the spoon will be there. It will be there in the drawer. In the cup. In the hand. On the table. In the moment. Not announcing itself. Not asking for thanks. Just doing what it always has. Being a small curve of patience. A quiet hero of the dinner table. And so, as the light dims, and the day winds down, and the sounds grow soft, the spoon waits. Not because it needs to. But because it always has. There is comfort in that. There is comfort in the ordinary. There is comfort in knowing that some things, even now, remain unchanged.